They told you heaven was above, a distant throne, a distant judge, angels with feathered wings hovering beyond a bright horizon. Now imagine the opposite, a heaven that treads the same soil as you, a heaven that slides down the mountainside into your village at dawn, a heaven whose rivers remember names and whose light is woven into bread and song. That reversal is not a novelty of poetry. It is the central movement of a living tradition. The astonishing differences. How the Ethiopian Bible describes heaven begins there, with a single stubborn question. What happens to our theology when the sacred is not up there but beside and within us? To answer that, we must approach a different memory of Scripture and a different set of liturgical habits. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserves a canon larger than the 66 books most Protestants and Catholics use. In the Ethiopian Church's long memory are roughly 81 books, an expanded library that includes materials not generally familiar in the West, books such as 1 Enoch and Jubilees, among others. Calling it the canon risks simplification. Historians debate how these lists developed and why certain texts were kept where others were not. Still, the practical effect is clear. A broader textual horizon helped shape a distinct imagination of God, of angels, and of the life to come. This is not simply a matter of more pages in a Bible. It is a different set of images, liturgical rhythms, and theological priorities shaped by geography, worship, and history. Picture the Ethiopian highlands, plateaus rising into clouds, stone churches carved from living rock, prayer echoing in narrow, cool interiors where incense hangs like a second sky. Imagine communities organized around monastic centers, processions across fields, and communal feasts that bind memory, law, and the sacramental life into one fabric. In these landscapes, the sky does not feel remote. It is present, close in altitude, close in imagination, and that intimacy is reflected in texts and prayers that speak of heaven as neighbor rather than as an inaccessible realm. If you have ever stood on a highland ridge in mist and watched clouds drift at eye level, you know how this landscape rewrites the basic human orientation of up and down. For an Ethiopian parishioner, whether monk or cantor, the vertical axis that many Western images depend on becomes porous. The sacred descends into the paths people walk. The holy sites under the same roof. When the canonical imagination builds on such terrain, theological priorities shift. Salvation is less about exit and more about healing. Eschatology is less about relocation and more about restoration. That simple geographic fact helps explain why the Ethiopian vision of heaven often reads as an extension and fulfillment of creation, rather than a radical abandonment of it. But geography alone would be insufficient to reframe heaven so decisively. Liturgy does the other half of the work. Ethiopian Christian worship is intensely embodied and communal. Long liturgies that intertwine chant, incense, dance, and fasting. The rhythmic repetition of psalms braided into daily life. Processions that move sacred objects through fields and streets. In such a spiritual economy, heaven becomes a domestic reality. Something rehearsed in communal gestures rather than merely promised as an afterlife. The people sing toward the presence answers in rhythm. If heaven is rehearsed in the life of the liturgy, it is not surprising that in many Ethiopian texts, the otherworldly domain is described in terms that connote agriculture, rivers, family, and the immediate ecology. So what does this heaven look like on the page? To approach the answer is to step into images that resist the familiar classical pictorial vocabulary. Instead of pearly gates and cherubim with feathered arms, the Ethiopian descriptions offer living valleys, rivers that carry memory, and beings whose identity is closer to presence than to anthropomorphic winged creatures. Angels are often framed as manifestations of God's self-revelation, rather than as independent aerial beings. They are locutions of the divine, a presence that discloses rather than a separate agent that ferries souls. God is not solely seated far above. God walks among the people, sometimes in the language of Edenic return. Matter is not discarded but healed. Bodies participate in the future life. This emphasis on immanence, God beside the world, carries theological consequences. It reframes salvation, less as a private ticket out of the world and more as communal restoration of relationships between humans, between humanity and earth, and between creation and creator. It reconfigures angels as ways that God's self-disclosure touches human life, rather than as distant messengers perched on the rim of heaven. It imagines time as a fullness rather than a linear sequence. Past and future fold into a present, thick with meaning, where spiritual progress is often described less as transportation and more as awakening. You move toward deeper union with God not by a rocket-like ascent, but by a transformation of perception and participation. Before going deeper into the mystical map that emerges from Ethiopian materials, we should pause over an important caution. When I say the Ethiopian Bible, I do not mean to assert a single monolithic orthodoxy across 12 centuries and many regions. Ethiopian tradition names a wide and variegated ecclesial memory, monastic lineages, regional customs, and textual collections that shifted over time. Nor do I suggest that the Ethiopian canon is the one true Bible to which others must be compared. Rather, it is a preserved alternative memory, a hermeneutic trajectory with its own internal coherence and long-standing practices. Where scholarship is contested about the exact formation of the canon, about certain liturgical texts, or about precise transliterations of heavenly realms, I will be careful to flag uncertainty. Some names of the seven heavens, for example, appear with variant spellings in the sources. Where dependable form is lacking, I will mark the name as indefinido. Now to the heart of the matter. How does an 81-book horizon, a mountain geography, and a chant-heavy liturgy collaborate to produce a picture of heaven so different from what many of us expect? The best way to see this is to map the vertical, not as a single ledge but as a series of thresholds, a stair of spiritual stations, each a different manner of healing, knowledge, and union. Ethiopian imagery often speaks of seven heavens, layers or levels that are less about bureaucratic bureaucracy than about spiritual states, each with its own function on the soul's journey toward God. The names surface in texts and in oral imagination, but some spellings vary across manuscripts and dialects. I will indicate uncertain forms with indefinido. The first of these thresholds is often named Sakai. Think of Sakai as the threshold of release. Imagine standing at the edge of a field early in the morning, mist still learning the contours of the land. The threshold is the place where conscience loosens its rigid hold, and suffering begins to breathe in a different key. It is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It is quiet, an opening in the chest where grief is acknowledged and given a place to move. For communities scarred by drought, invasion, or loss, Sakai is the spiritual furniture of small mercies, the space where pain starts to be shared, where confession becomes a communal act, where the weight begins to be borne together. The image that accompanies Sakai in many Ethiopian descriptions is domestic, a low gate, a welcome mat, an invitation to step in and be attended to. Move past that gateway and you enter Kayama. If Sakai is release, Kayama is cleansing. The imagery becomes waterborne, rivers that wind into villages, rain-washing courtyards, hands dipped in a basin. Cleansing is not about ritual purity alone, but about reorientation. It is the work of memory remade. In several Ethiopian texts, the metaphors are strikingly tactile: soap as sacrament, water as recollection. Where Western metaphors sometimes push toward courtroom absolution, the Kayama imagery tends toward therapy and sanitation, wounds being carefully cleaned rather than visibly obliterated. An image surfaces again and again, a river that remembers your name. In this way of seeing, water archives personal history and returns it tenderly. The point is not to erase but to knit. The third and fourth stations, rendered in manuscripts with variant spellings, are often listed as mald, indefinido, and ban, indefinido, though other sources may spell them malt and barren. Mald centers on wisdom, on the slow and patient formation of discernment. Imagine the old monks in their rock-hewn cells, the teacher pointing to a pattern in the Psalms, the novice learning to read silence as a grammar. Mauld is less about intellectual accumulation and more about the cultivation of a listening heart. In the Ethiopian imagination, wisdom is not primarily propositional, it is experiential and liturgical. It grows in the soil of communal prayer, in the repetition of chants, in the embodied memory of gestures repeated across generations. Ban follows Mauld as a deepening of understanding, an enlargement of vision that allows the pilgrim to read creation as text. If Mauld gives the grammar of spiritual perception, Ban teaches syntax, how diverse signs in the created order relate to one another in a story that moves toward healing. At this level, one's perception shifts. The rusted hinge on a door is no longer incidental, but part of a network of meaning that includes neighbors, weather patterns, and ancestral promises. The map that emerges here is ecological, as much as it is soteriological. Creation participates in the soul's education. The world is not a backdrop, but a tutor. These first stations already change the logic of travel. Spiritual ascent, if ascent is even the right word, becomes a gradual interior reformation, release, cleansing, wisdom, and understanding. The movement is pedagogical and communal. It presumes that the soul cannot thrive in isolation, because the soul itself is understood relationally. That relational imagination undergirds a fundamental difference with many Western pictures of salvation, which often emphasize individual judgment and individual inheritance. Ethiopian thought insists that what is being restored is a network. Families, tribes, fields, the web of creation itself. Salvation is repair, not rescue. It is worth saying, again cautiously, that this theology does not erase the difference between creator and creation. The emphasis on healing and participation should not be read as pantheism. Rather, God's nearness is described in terms of presence and self-disclosure. God can walk among people because God remains greater than the world. That awareness of distinction preserves the reverence proper to worship, even while affirming the intimacy of God's engagement with the world. To see how deeply these ideas flow into everyday religious practice, look at ritual material culture. Consider the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved churches that are not merely monuments, but stages for embodied liturgy. The architecture itself teaches a theology. Sanctity is embedded in stone. Heaven is not located strictly above but within these chiseled caverns, where priests move between the people and the icons, where shadow and candlelight create a sense that the sacred and the ordinary are braided. These churches are not neutral aesthetic choices. They shape prayer and shape imagination. The acoustics, the procession routes, the placement of icons, all of it directs attention to a God who meets worshippers in the midst of their daily geography. Similarly, the monastic rhythms, long vigils, sustained fasting, the communal chant, function as a spiritual laboratory where the transformations associated with the seven heavens are practiced. You do not merely hear about possession of wisdom or union with God. You lean into practices that cultivate those states. This is a key point. Liturgical formation over generations can produce a theology that even literary texts then try to capture. In other words, worship shapes doctrine as much as doctrine shapes worship. When we read the descriptions of heavenly beings in Ethiopian literature, the same patterns appear, less emphasis on wings and armor, more emphasis on presence, utterance, and disclosure. Angels are often described not primarily as aerial beings, but as particular modes of God's self-manifestation. They are the voice in the courtyard, the sudden warmth in a child's palm, the person at the door with bread. This is not to deny certain iconographic traditions that do portray angels with wings. Rather, it is to note a theological tendency in which angelic activity is integrated into relational presence. In some liturgical texts, an angelic encounter reads almost like a form of hospitality. God's revelation comes as an arrival that is also an invitation to share bread and song. That approach to angelology dovetails with another distinctive theme: the restoration of creation. Where some eschatologies speak of the eventual discarding of the world in favor of a spiritual paradise, many Ethiopian texts present the future as a healed and renewed creation. the earth transfigured, not annihilated. This is a restorative eschatology. The vineyard is not replaced so much as grafted into a fuller life. Bodies are not liabilities to be shed, but the very medium through which the fullness of God's purpose is realized. Flesh is not a mere shell, it carries destiny. This restorative emphasis has ethical implications that are surprisingly concrete. If heaven is the healed world, then acts of justice and mercy are not simply preliminaries to salvation. They are rehearsals for the restored order. Feeding the hungry, caring for fields, tending elderly neighbors, refusing exploitation. These practices are not merely optional pieties or social niceties. They are liturgical acts that participate in the work of transfiguration. In the Ethiopian vision, the church is not solely a shelter for souls, but a primary instrument in the repair of social and ecological relations. The boundary between worship and ethics narrows. The Eucharistic table becomes a training ground for the coming age. All of this is consonant with a peculiar conception of time, often found in Ethiopian spiritual literature. Time is not a narrow linear corridor that runs from birth to death to judgment, and then to a distant eternity. Instead, time is fuller, folded, dense, an experienced present layered with memories and promises. The future is present to the faithful in liturgical memory. The past is an active resource. Spiritual progress, then, is less about traveling through chronological stages and more about expanding one's capacity to participate in a plurimatic present, a now where past grace and future hope meet. This theological anthropology, one that treats persons as constituted by their relations in time and community, makes sense within a liturgical system that rehearses the whole of salvation in seasonal cycles and daily offices. At this point, the map of the seven heavens begins to look less like an ethereal skyscraper and more like a cultivated landscape, thresholds that correspond to social, liturgical, and interior practices. Yet questions remain. How do later stations function? What sort of experiences mark the deeper levels, those often rendered in the manuscripts as maios, zeals or zeal, indefinito, and the final threshold, era? And crucially, how do these states translate into communal practice and ethical responsibility back here on the ground? To move into those deeper stations, we must, for a moment, attend to the language scholars and monastics use to describe them, the metaphors, the ritual contexts, the examples from hagiography. Hagiographical stories in the Ethiopian corpus often narrate saints who, after long ascetic lives of prayer and service, enter further levels of nearness. Their reports are not treatises of metaphysics but testimonies, a monk who hears a music that mends his memory, a cantor who sees faces in the steam of church incense that turn into a communion of ancestors and strangers. These stories train the imagination to see spiritual ascent as relational and sensory, yet we must also hold to a hermeneutic sobriety. The seven heavens, their names and their functions, emerge in texts that are often poetic and performative. They are parables of participation, not literalist schematics imposed by metaphysical necessity. Where the tradition speaks of primordial sound or a level of unified will, it is often gesturing toward experiences of unitive prayer, not promising empirically measurable strata in an ontological sky. That distinction matters because it preserves theological humility. These are descriptions offered as means to further devotion and love, not as scientific diagrams. Even so, the resonance between such mystical language and contemporary curiosities is striking. Some listeners today find surprising affinities between certain Ethiopian images, time as folded, reality vibrating with levels of perception, and how modern physicists and philosophers describe temporality and information. It is tempting to turn those resonances into proof of one another. The better posture is wonder with restraint, to name the consonants without conflating theological claims and scientific models. These are resonances, not identifications. Before we press deeper into the middle and upper stations of the heavenly map, it helps to return briefly to the communal ethics implied by what we have seen so far. If the first stations, Sakai, Kayama, Mald, indefinido, ban, indefinido, are about shared release, shared cleansing, communal wisdom, and enlarged understanding. Then the practices that correspond to them are communal as well. Confession is public, repentance is a shared work, wisdom is taught in the round, service to the needy is liturgical. This is not a small point. It reframes how one measures spiritual progress and where pastoral energy should be devoted, not primarily to individualistic piety, but to collective formation. The Church's role in such an imagination is less a social agency that augments a personal salvation program, and more an organism that incarnates the future in present habits. The implications reach beyond the walls of the Church. In a world where political life is often reduced to competition and neighborliness is strained by suspicion, the Ethiopian emphasis on salvation as repair offers a corrective. It does not provide policy blueprints, it rehearses a different moral grammar. If our images of heaven shape our politics, if a heaven above encourages readiness to abandon the world to its devices, while a heaven beside calls us to repair it, then the imaginative work of theology becomes deeply consequential. At this point, the narrative must turn toward the deeper heavens. The map has been sketched, the ground-level practices are visible. What remains is to enter the middle and upper stations, to tell how primordial sound or unified will functions in the spiritual life, and to show how those high images circle back to humble ethics. That movement from the horizontal to the vertical, if vertical remains the right word, is where the Ethiopian imagination grows most compelling, and where misunderstandings are most likely if we rush. So we step now toward the middle thresholds with care, knowing that names vary, and that the best approach is descriptive and interpretive rather than absolutist. The fifth station often appears as meos. Here the texts speak of a convergence of wills, an alignment between the desire of the soul and the will of God. Imagine two rivers merging into one current. Each river preserves its memory but moves in a new, unified direction. In meos, the pilgrim's desires are reoriented so that love and will harmonize. This is not a loss of individuality, but a reformation of freedom, a heart that chooses rightly because it recognizes what is life-giving. Higher still, manuscripts sometimes list a station rendered as zeals or zeal, indefinido. Here the language becomes a bit more abstract. Primordial sound, the vibration that undergirds being. Poets and monks have long used the metaphor of sound for spiritual encounter. The hum of prayer, the chant that holds a community steady, the word that names and sustains. In these descriptions, the sound is not merely auditory. It is the first-order relation by which creatures are summoned into being. Encounter with this level may be framed as a participation in the music that binds creation, an experience of being held within a cosmic liturgy. Finally, the uppermost threshold is often called ara. Ara is the brink of nearness, the place where the distinction between creature and creator is most intensely felt, but not erased. It is the limit where the soul is drawn into immediate presence, a nearness so full that usual categories of space and time falter. This is the culmination of the pilgrimage, not the obliteration of the self, but the fulfillment of its capacity for love. In the literature, ara is described in paradoxical ways. The soul is both known fully and invited to continue loving. The beloved is utterly other, yet intimately close. We have now sketched the sevenfold map as it appears in a range of Ethiopian texts, naming the stations and offering interpretive notes where names remain uncertain. But the map alone is not the destination. The next question is practical and pastoral. How do these lofty images affect concrete life? How do they orient worship, ethics, and communal formation in ways that encourage care for the poor, stewardship of land, and solidarity amid suffering? How does the image of a heaven that walks beside the world change the way a person prays in the morning or shares bread in a drought year? Answering those questions requires moving from description to lived theology. It requires attention to the stories that have shaped communities, stories of saints whose charity healed a village, of cantors whose songs knitted together enemies, of monastic communities that preserve texts and practices through long periods of hardship. It requires listening to the way rituals form habits, how fasting cultivates empathy for the hungry, how communal confession teaches mutual responsibility, how processions tie prayer to the bodies and paths of ordinary life. In short, it requires seeing doctrine not as a map held at arm's length, but as a set of practices that shape how people inhabit the world. We are on the verge now of those practical applications, and of a deeper exploration of the middle and upper heavens, how they reshape notions of time, matter, and community. But before we tread further, hold a single image: a river that remembers your name. Imagine its slow current, its memory of storms and springs, its manner of learning the contours of your wounds and returning them to you in the language of mercy. That image captures what is at stake in these differences. The Ethiopian vision does not offer a quick escape. It offers a long, patient restoration, in which the very elements of creation are addressed, healed, and invited into union. From here the path climbs into subtler turf, the ethical corollaries, the resonances with contemporary science cautiously named, the ways communal liturgy prepares hearts for the work of restoration. We will follow those strands, paying attention to contested names, to varied manuscript traditions, and to the lived practices that make theology credible on the ground. For now, keep with you the sense that what is at stake is nothing less than how Christians imagine God's future, and how that imagination shapes the way they live today. If that river has followed you this far in the imagination, let it carry us now into the practical and pastoral ground, where theology becomes habit, and habit becomes hope. If this astonishes you, and if it pushes at the edges of an expectation you hold, stay with the exploration. Let the question sit: what changes when heaven is beside us? Visual: a slow river threading a village at dawn, children running its banks, elders leaning over to touch its water as if remembering names. Stories that train a people. Across the Ethiopian corpus, many of the most persuasive arguments for this way of imagining heaven are not abstract theologies but stories, hagiographical glimpses and local memories that show doctrine being lived. Listen to an example drawn from the kind of tales preserved in monastic circles. A young cantor named Tesfaye lives in a highland community that has endured a season of famine. He learns a particular chant in the monastery, a low repeating melody that the older singers say is an anchor. One evening, after a night of prayer, Tesfaye walks toward the village and finds two families arguing over the last sacks of grain. He sings at first softly, then with the whole chest. The sound gathers people, anger slackens, the neighbors begin to talk. Later they say the chant opened a door to remembering mutual obligations. The narrative does not present the chant as a magic key that solves structural scarcity. It presents music as a practice that enacts a different moral grammar, one in which memory, song, and shared responsibility make a space where repair can begin. Visual: a candlelit courtyard after a long fast, a young cantor's breath making patterns in the cold air as an old woman lifts hands to the chant. Another story: a widow, Astor, who tends a small plot of land, becomes the center of a healing circle after she invites neighbors to bury the bones of a stray animal found near the field. The act is small, an improvised burial, a shared prayer, but in weeks the neighbors begin to tend each other's gardens, share grain, and form a mutual labor pool. The tale circulates not to teach doctrinal propositions, but to show how attention to the life of the soil and the habits of mourning can reweave a frayed social fabric. These narratives train an imagination where sacrament and social repair are braided. What these stories teach is practical. Liturgical practices, chant, procession, fasting, confession, are not rehearsals for another world so much as instruments for making this world more hospitable to the presence of God that, in Ethiopian texts, often moves like a neighbor. If heaven is beside us, hospitality is not optional. It is an index of spiritual health. Visual: hands breaking bread in a communal courtyard, sunlight through wattle and daub, an old psalm book resting between bowls. How practice shapes perception. There is a reciprocity here. Text and ritual form one another. The expanded canon, books that stay alive in monastic libraries and in the hands of cantors, sustains particular liturgical forms. Those forms, in turn, habituate bodies to certain patterns of attention. A people who chant long offices learn to hold time differently. A people who process icons through fields learn to read terrain as sacramental. This is not mystical idealizing. It is socio-theological mechanics. Habit shapes perception, which, over generations, shapes doctrine. Consider fasting. In many Ethiopian settings, fasting is emphatically social, done in community, calibrated to agricultural cycles, and often kept with the poor rather than away from them. Fasting teaches empathy. A body that tastes hunger and solidarity with others learns to prioritize the relief of hunger. When part of a tradition that imagines heaven as a healed creation, fasting looks less like an escape from the world and more like training the body to desire the same kind of world God desires. That training then shows up in practices of sharing, organizing, and cultivating land. Visual, a communal fast broken together at sundown, a low table, shared plates, laughter tempered with reverence. Angels as disclosure, social ethics in theological clothes. If angels in many Ethiopian texts are modes of God's disclosure, forms in which God's presence is felt, then angelology becomes a theology of neighborliness. An angel could be any arrival that discloses God's care, the unexpected bread, the traveler who mends a roof, the stranger who turns into kin. This reading has ethical consequences. It collapses, in some sense, the distance between liturgical reverence and daily acts of mercy. Hospitality is not merely a social good. In the imagination, it becomes the context in which divine disclosure regularly happens. That does not mean the tradition collapses creator into creation. Theological nuance is preserved. Angels, as divine self-expression, do not become identical with created persons, but they do insist that the extraordinary may appear in the ordinary. Thus, a liturgy that rehearses angelic presence cultivates a public instinct to be attentive. People who sing of angels in the context of communal tables are more likely to treat strangers' needs as sacred obligations. Visual, a stranger arriving at dusk and being embraced at a family gate, an old hymn underscoring the moment. Time thickened, liturgy, memory, and the plerimatic present. We have already suggested that Ethiopian prayer practices produce a different sense of time. To expand that, pay attention to what long liturgy does to memory. When psalms and feasts are repeated across cycles, the community's past is not archived as inert fact, but rehearsed and reactivated. The past returns as presence, and the future is anticipated as urgency in the present. This is what some sources mean by calling the present full. It contains memory and promise at once. This thickened sense of time makes the ethical horizon more immediate. If the future redemption is already being named and practiced in the now, if prayers reenact the promised healing, then ordinary acts become charged with eschatological significance. Caring for a neighbor's field is not merely pragmatism. It is an anticipation of the healed vineyard. Visual, a procession that retraces a storied path each year, villagers following with lit torches as ancestors' names are called. Resonances with modern thought, cautious affinities. Some observers notice consonances between these theological motifs, nonlinear temporality, vibration as foundational reality, layered levels of perception, and contemporary scientific or philosophical speculation. Physicists speak of time that behaves differently at different scales. Philosophers explore theories of information and relational ontologies. It is important to keep two cautions in plain sight. First, theological language and scientific models operate in different registers. Theology shapes meaning and ethics, while science models empirical relations. Second, pointing to a resonance is not the same as claiming equivalence. It is a poetic echo, not a proof. That said, the resonance invites fruitful conversation. When a tradition speaks of primordial sound, The station sometimes rendered in manuscripts as zeals or zeal indefinido. It is gesturing at an ordering, a patterning that constitutes meaning, what some philosophers call information. When monks say that chant holds a community together, they are describing a phenomenon social scientists might also study. Coordinated rhythmic activity increases cooperation. To name such overlaps is to open a generous dialogue, not to collapse theology into physics. Visual. A small choir in a cavernous church, their voices generating a tangible warmth that seems almost to rearrange the dust in the air. Material care and communal repair. If the final kingdom is a healed creation, then the ethic of the present must include stewardship of the material world. The Ethiopian imagination, rooted in terraced fields, communal wells, and centuries of living within fragile ecologies, has practical habits to show. Soil care is worship, seed saving is a sacred duty, sharing water is liturgy. Furthermore, social repair is environmental care. When neighbors pool labor and guard springs against overuse, they enact an eschatological rehearsal. They make space for a regenerated creation. These practices are not utopian fantasies but pragmatic acts. They require institutions, monasteries that conserve seeds, parish councils that manage water rights, people's associations that mediate disputes. The theological imagination supplies motivation and a narrative frame. Care is not only ethical, but also anticipatory. It replays the coming kingdom in miniature. Visual. Terraced fields tended collectively, morning mist lifting as elders and youth carry baskets together. Politics without abandonment. One of the clearest implications of an adjacent heaven is political. If hope is not a prompt to abandon the world, then it is a prompt to repair it. This transforms how communities orient to governance and public life. It does not translate into a single political program. Rather, it supplies a moral grammar that prizes repair over escape, solidarity over individual accumulation, and common goods over privatized salvation. In contexts where resources are scarce and state institutions are weak, church-based networks often assume public tasks, feeding programs, education, conflict mediation. The ethical imagination that sees heaven beside the world legitimates this kind of communal responsibility. Visual. A village council meeting held in the churchyard, plans for a communal well sketched in the dirt. Careful hermeneutics. What the tradition claims and what scholars debate. It is necessary to state the scholarly caution once more. The Ethiopian canon's size and contents are historically complex. Lists varied across centuries, monastic centers, and regional practices. Saying that the Ethiopian Bible contains roughly 81 books is a descriptive shorthand for a broad ecclesial memory, rather than a claim of uniformity. Where manuscripts diverge, on names of heavenly stations or on liturgical phrasing, scholars and monastics sometimes disagree. For that reason, some names of the seven heavens appear with alternate spellings in manuscripts. Where the evidence is uncertain, I will mark those names indefinido. The interpretive posture is best characterized as humility. These descriptions aim to report a lived imagination, not to adjudicate ancient bibliographical disputes conclusively. Visual. A stack of worn manuscripts, hands turning brittle pages by lamplight. Practical takeaways for contemporary Christians. What does this mean for someone who watches from another tradition and wonders how to embody a theology that imagines heaven beside the world? Here are several accessible practices, offered not as a program, but as experiments in reorientation. Small forms of discipleship that cultivate the sensibility we have been tracing. Ilida 1. Practice sustained liturgical attention. You needn't join a monastery to learn how repetitive prayer reshapes time. Commit to a short set of psalms or chants each day for a bounded period, a week, a month. Notice how repetition thickens memory and how names of neighbors begin to surface in prayer. 2. Reclaim hospitality as a spiritual discipline. Invite someone to share a meal you did not have to prepare alone. Treat hospitality as the place where angelic disclosure is expected rather than hoped for. 3. Move with seasons and soil. If you can, participate in communal care of a green space or a community garden. Planting and tending are ways of practicing the theology of transfiguration, simple forms of rehearsal. 4. Practicing sacramental solidarity. Fast in solidarity with those who lack food. If fasting is not physically appropriate for you, adopt another solidarity practice, e.g., donate the cost of a meal to a food program. Let fasting shape desire toward the neighbor. 5. Learn a song and sing it corporately. Chants or short hymns train bodies to breathe together. Coordinated rhythm fosters cooperative networks that habitually look outward. 6. Public confession and mutual accountability. In small, trusted communities, confessing hurts and wrongs aloud, and receiving communal help to repair them, models the Sakai-like release that begins healing. None of these guarantees spiritual success. They are practices for formation, habits that, when maintained, tend to produce the kinds of attention the Ethiopian tradition prizes. Visual. Neighbors planting seedlings together. A small child watering a young sapling while an elder watches with a smile. Ethical pitfalls to avoid. 2 cautions. First, do not romanticize suffering as if suffering is necessarily redemptive. The Ethiopian imagination honors lament and repair, but it does not fetishize hardship. The work of restoring creation repudiates any theology that would make suffering an end in itself. Second, beware of instrumentalizing tradition for contemporary agendas. The Ethiopian vision invites solidarity and stewardship. It does not hand over its texts as tools for political triumphalism. Respect for the sources and their contexts matters. Visual. A cracked hand gently smoothing soil, not in triumph but in steady care. Music, memory, and the community of saints. Hagiographical testimony in the Ethiopian tradition regularly presents music and memory as vehicles of renewal. A saint hears a hymn that mends memory. A cantor's song heals a grudge. Why music? Because rhythm organizes time, and because song encodes communal memory in a way prose cannot. In a liturgical setting, memory is not cognitive only, but somatic. Bodies learn histories through breath. Breath recues the heart reorients the will. For communities, this is a potent pedagogical tool. Practiced regularly, music fosters resilience. It makes a people capable of holding grief and hope at once. Visual. A monastery's small choir practicing a single phrase until voices align into a single sustained note that seems to occupy the stone. Angels, hospitality, and sacramental imagination. An ethics of expectancy. If angels are understood as manifestations by which God self-discloses, then the practice of hospitality acquires a sacramental quality. This is not superstition. It is an ethical posture of expectancy. Expectancy generates behavior. People who expect God to disclose God's self through neighbors act differently toward those neighbors. They ask questions, offer places to sleep, engage in repair. This does not replace structured aid or policy solutions, but it softens the ground where policies and institutions operate. It cultivates a moral atmosphere conducive to generous public life. Visual. A late-night knock on a door, answered with bread and a blanket. A neighbor's hand steadying another's. Translation and textual care. A methodological aside. Practically speaking, those who would study these texts further should remember the philological challenges. Manuscripts vary. Names appear in multiple forms. We have used Sakai, Kayama, Mald, Indefinido, Ban, Indefinido, Maios, Ziles, Zeal, Indefinido, and Ara to sketch the sevenfold map, but transliterations differ across sources. Scholars working with gaze and local languages must attend to manuscript families, regional pronunciations, and liturgical usages. For readers, the most responsible posture is curiosity with restraint. Enjoy the images, take the ethical promptings seriously, and consult scholarly editions or translations for technical work. Visual. Close-up of a page in Ge'ez with marginal notes, a scholar's pencil tracing variant readings. What heaven beside us asks of our imaginations. The larger claim we have been circling is this: the shape of heaven that a community holds Matters because it orients action. To imagine heaven as exclusively up and away is to risk a theology that licenses neglect of the created order. To imagine heaven as beside us, woven into bread and soil and song, is to prompt a spirituality of repair. Neither picture alone exhausts Christian hope, but the Ethiopian tradition provides a clarifying corrective to any reading that divorces eschatology from ecology, hope from neighbor love. Visual. Children playing beneath a fig tree while elders read scripture. The branches arc like a canopy, meeting sky and earth. Practical challenges and institutional responsibilities. If a community adopts this imaginal frame, it must also build institutions that enable the vision to be more than sentiment. Monastic centers historically preserved texts and practices, but village-level institutions, cooperative grain stores, water committees, shared childcare networks, are equally crucial. The Church's role in such a model is not merely ceremonial, it is organizational. Often the most resilient responses to famine, conflict, or displacement arise when liturgical imagination meets administrative competence. This synergy matters. Visual. A parish notice board listing rotating communal labor days and grain-sharing schedules. The ecumenical horizon. Learning across traditions. One of the most gracious features of studying the Ethiopian imagination is that it invites ecumenical learning without claiming exclusive superiority. The Western theological imagination can learn from practices that prioritize communal repair, and Ethiopian sources can also profitably dialogue with other traditions' emphases on individual conscience, legal rights, or institutional development. Comparative study, if conducted in humility, expands the Church's capacity to love the world. Visual. A small ecumenical gathering under a tree where different clergy exchange prayers and concrete ideas for cooperation. A final pastoral summons. What I want to leave you with is not a neat program but a posture. The posture asks you to notice. Notice how you speak of heaven. Notice the verbs you use about the world. Notice whether your hope inclines you to abandonment or repair. Begin with small experiments. Sing with others. Share bread with someone you do not know well. Commit to a short season of fasting in solidarity. Plant something with your hands. Join a committee that helps manage a common resource. See whether your affections shift. Theology is not a parked theory, but a formation of desires. Visual. A person at dawn carrying water to a new communal plant bed. The light catching the water like a promise. Closing reflection. The astonishing differences, honored. From the beginning, our inquiry took its name from surprise. The astonishing differences. How the Ethiopian Bible describes heaven. That astonishment is the right starting place, an openness to learning. The differences matter because they model an alternative way of being Christian in the world, one that sees heaven as neighbor and future as rehearsal. The Ethiopian biblical and liturgical memory offers resources for a church that longs to be faithful to God's promise and faithful to creation. If you walk away with one conviction, let it be this. The shape of our hope shapes the shape of our hands. If heaven is beside us, our hands must be busy with care. Visual. A wide shot of a highland village at dusk. Lights in stone doorways, smoke rising from hearths, a distant chant threading the valley. Before we close, a humble invitation. Tell us how you imagine heaven. Do you picture gates above or a river that remembers your name? Share your glimpses below, stories, images, recollections. If this exploration moved you, consider subscribing to follow other forgotten maps and traditions. If you know someone who cherishes liturgy, ecology, or the history of Scripture, share this with them. Let these images, valleys that heal, chants that reform memory, neighbors who embody angels, have the chance to widen the imagination of others. Visual, comment icons and images of people from various places sharing brief notes, the screen dissolving into suggestions for further reading. Read more with care. Respect sources. Attend to practice. Live as if the kingdom's rehearsal has already begun in the small acts of mercy and stewardship you can do today. If you would like recommendations for accessible translations or scholarly works that treat these topics with both rigor and reverence, tell me in the comments and I'll point you to reliable resources and translations. Keep the question alive. How does what we read shape what we do? And may the river that remembers names continue to teach us the art of tending one another.